The history of social work, as described in the book, really frames the steps that we needed to take for the field to become the way it is. And just as importantly, it reminds us that the field isn't done progressing, wasn't made perfectly, and it's not perfect still. So one topic that I want to discuss in this video is the concept of the deserving and the undeserving poor, especially with regards to one's moral character. I will split this video into two parts, one explaining the poor laws that determine the deserving and undeserving poor, and the second part will address how this concerns the morality, and especially with regards to the deservedness. Of course, to start, I will explain what the deserving and undeserving poor are. So the book describes the deserving poor to be people of good moral character and who are only temporarily out of luck, through no fault of their own. They did not ask for help, they were clean, and they were tidy. On the other hand, the undeserving poor are those who are deemed lazy or morally degenerate. Oof. These terms were brought about in the Poor Law of 1834, and the book and other sources say that the Canadian structure for public assistance was based on this, so I'm going to speak more on this. Okay, so in 1601, the Poor Law was passed in England, and would later be amended again in 1834. Before the first Poor Law, parishes were already providing some relief to the poor. They saw it as part of their moral Christian duty. And more importantly for the policymakers, they had registers for the poor. You could now officially be considered poor and be in a list for it. Soon after, the Justice of Peace categorized these poor into three neat classifications. Those who were willing to work but could not were the able-bodied poor. So you could give them work or some other kind of relief, like the dole money or food or clothing. Those who are of the wrong age, either too young or too old, or because they were sick, those were called the impotent poor. They couldn't take care of themselves, so they had to be looked after in almshouses or hospitals or orphanages or poorhouses. Children who were poor would be given a trade apprenticeship so that they could learn a trade and eventually come out. Last up, we have those who could work but chose not to. These were called the idle poor. You whip them publicly to learn the error of their ways. And then the Poor Law of 1601 was passed, which sought out to make poor relief a local responsibility. Local property owners were now taxed to provide the relief of the poor, and each parish now appointed two overseers. These people would answer to the Justice of Peace, and they were in charge of the finances of poor relief. This included setting the amount of money needed for poor relief, collecting the money from property owners, dispensing the money, and they were also in charge of poorhouses. On the subject of relief, you get two types of relief, outdoor and indoor relief. Outdoor relief would be the type that you give to the able-bodied poor, and as I said, this is money or some other relief. But they would stay in their own homes, so they stayed out of the doors of the parish. Indoor relief brought people indoors, so the poor would go to almshouses, the sick go to the hospitals, the orphans to orphanages, and the idle poor were put into work in workhouses for cheap labor. At this time, the workhouse was still in working condition. They had enough going for them that these places sometimes provided more than what some rent payers could afford. They were still used for cheap labor, but at least the lodges were clean. Sometimes the people donated food or clothing or furniture, and the food was better than some of the workers were used to. Then comes the Poor Law of 1834. We already talked about how they divided the poor, so let's provide some context to these ideas. Detractors of the old Poor Law argued that it promoted laziness and lack of effort, especially to people who they viewed as undeserving of the relief they got. After all, they were poor. And not just poor, but also they were lazy, unclean, degenerate. They expected people to just give them money and lodging for nothing. Never mind the fact that they literally worked in these workhouses. But in response to the criticisms of the old Poor Law, the Poor Law of 1834 was enacted. So these brought about some changes, mostly in reducing the funding and the scope of poor relief, including sending all the poor to workhouses instead of separate facilities. But this wasn't just a global reduction. It was very much a targeted effort to ensure that the poor people would not contribute to moral degradation. What does that mean, right? This means that aid was not just reduced, but it was especially reduced for specific people. For example, mothers with illegitimate children received less welfare. Because you don't want to promote having bastards. They also removed the concept of outdoor relief altogether. since no morally upstanding person would dare accept handouts. They also made conditions for workhouses absolutely abhorrent. A place that was once considered to be relief for people who were able-bodied to do work, for lodging and necessities were stripped. After all, if you were able-bodied, then you should work without asking for handouts. So you're morally degenerate for having an able body that won't provide you with the things you need to survive without assistance. Thus, you deserve to be punished. Needless to say, these workhouses were not good facilities. They were designed specifically to humiliate people for being poor. The food was bland, sleeping arrangements were crowded, they had uncomfortable uniforms, and you could only take a bath once a week. Supervised. They watched you bathe. Ew. People have compared these workhouses to prisons for the poor. And this resulted in the workhouses, which was designed to be relief for the able-bodied poor who were considered previously to be at least deserving poor, to become so abhorrent that the able-bodied poor became a minority in these workhouses. It was very clear that the poor law has stopped being about providing relief to the poor and instead about making moral claims about poverty. The shift of moral responsibility changed from the people providing the relief to those who are receiving the relief. That's what the second part of the video will be about. Now, to start this section, morality, I want to introduce one of the central most tenets of Western moral philosophy. This is, ought implies can. This was an idea presented by one of the most influential moral philosophers of the Western world, Immanuel Kant. And I highly recommend learning more about him, especially in social work. His moral philosophy is pretty reminiscent of these doctrines of respect for persons, so I'm going to just provide a crash course link in the description. So what does ought implies can mean? It means that if we say that a person is acting morally or immorally, they ought to act in a certain way. That's what the ought is, how they should act. But that also suggests that this person can act in the way that they ought to act. Before I continue, I want to acknowledge that there are objections to this idea, but this is still an idea worth discussing. So here's an example. If it is your moral responsibility to vote, then it follows that you must be able to vote in the first place. You can't be expected to vote if you can't vote. So there's no point in telling a 16-year-old in Canada that it's their duty to vote in the elections. Because it's not. Now, how does this relate to this idea of deserving and undeserving poor? If you recall, the book says that the deserving poor are poor through no fault of their own, and the undeserving poor were considered morally degenerate. It seems like from the beginning, the issue of poor law and poor relief in general has been a question of morality. When instating that poor law back in 1601, it was to put the responsibility of providing poor relief to the local communities. It was considered by the parishes to be a moral duty of the church for them to provide relief to the poor and perform these acts of mercy. However, we can see that from the enactment of the latter poor law in 1834, that there was this shift of moral responsibility from the people providing the aid to the people receiving the aid. Now, you only deserve to receive the aid if you did nothing wrong, or at least anything that was perceived to be morally wrong. And this is where the ought implies can idea really matters. Because you're saying that being poor when you have an able body is wrong, then you're also saying that being poor is a choice and that you can do something about it. They're giving a pass somewhat to the people who are sick, young, or old because they expect that they can't do anything about it, so they don't have any responsibility to do so. But after the revision, there are still able-bodied poor who live their entire lives in these workhouses, and I can't imagine it's because they're especially lazy. After all, they had to work in the workhouses. And I also can't imagine that's because they chose to live like this. After all, it sucked. So now my question is, which of the people are in a better position to do something about their moral duties? Is it the people who are providing the aid or the people receiving the aid? After all, the people who are providing the aid has this sense of duty, born from religion, sure, but they believe that it is their moral responsibility. Or is it the people who are receiving the aid, who have, so to speak, a responsibility to themselves? I am inclined to say that the people who had to work and live in these deplorable positions probably don't want to. And if they're given the choice or the chance or the capacity to, they'd much rather work or live somewhere else. And again, I want to be fair here. I'm not making any value judgments on the people who are providing the payment for the relief. After all, they were regular citizens who are not necessarily lavishly wealthy. But the moral responsibility was already present at the time. It's one thing to believe that they don't have that moral responsibility, and another to believe that they have that moral responsibility, but choose to point to somewhere else for them to succeed. The old poor law was based on the idea that the local communities were responsible for providing this poor relief. And I'm also not saying that there weren't poor people who were actually lacking the morality department. The revision of the law in 1834 itself is just something that didn't need to appeal to morality of the poor in the first place. And this brings me to my next big issue about having the poor be categorized into deserving and undeserving. What do we mean by deserving and undeserving? The use of the term in deserving and undeserving poor seems to attach them to a person's moral character. After all, the people who deserved aid were faultless in their situation, while the people who were undeserving of aid were morally degenerate or lazy or what have you. But is this right? Okay, I'm going to reduce the argument just a little bit. I'm going to say that it seems to be this attitude that if you are morally irresponsible, then you deserve punishment. But if you are morally responsible, you deserve to be rewarded. Irresponsible, bad. Responsible, good. Okay, so if you're a good poor person, you deserve aid, but if you're a bad poor person, you deserve, well, prison, basically. This rubs me a wrong way for a few reasons. So first of all, consider mothers who have had illegitimate children. I mentioned previously that they receive less welfare than other mothers. Some people may consider this to be a morally objectionable choice, and especially so at the time. But how does withdrawing the aid to these people help uphold moral responsibility? My objection is that deservedness, especially when it comes to providing aid, becomes a method of coercing people who have less power to the same moral standard. You want people that you have power over to follow the same rules as you do, the same self-inflicted rules as you do. And the intention seems to be to deter people from performing these acts, but really all it does is potentially deter poor people from performing these acts. Consider the case of Sally. Sally had an illegitimate child, but because she has a good social status, people can't force her into these deplorable positions. So instead, they publicly shame her, they make her unwelcomed in several spaces, and some even assault her. She was unaffected by the poor law, and she was more than punished enough. The fact that the poor law changed did not make it so that she was more or less inclined to perform the action. Sorry, Bruce. You gotta go. Now imagine that due to circumstances, Sally becomes poor and files for relief. People still publicly shame her. They make her unwelcome in different spaces. They even assault her. But now they're also denying her aid that she otherwise would have gotten. So now it seems that because they have power over her, they can coerce her into these ideals of morality. Their own ideals, not Sally's. This just seems scummy to me, you know? Just another way for the man to bring me down. And this brings me to my next problem. And it comes from a problem of practicality. How does denying the service because of some notion of deservedness actually help anyone? Take Sally again. Even if we suppose that Sally magically understands that having illegitimate children is bad, she can't undo her actions, nor can she make amends. But now, she also doesn't get aid. The idea behind rewards and punishment is supposed to be about encouraging and deterring behavior. How effective this is contentious. But let's be generous and just say that this is the intention. But the way that these rewards and punishments are implemented, it doesn't encourage or deter repeat behavior. If you're undeserving poor and you're able-bodied, then to escape the punishment, you have to find work elsewhere, not a workhouse. And this did happen sometimes at the time. When there was work available locally, some people would take on these jobs and leave the workhouse. But often enough, this work was temporary, so these people with no property to return to, they would have to come back to the workhouse after their job is finished. And here's the problem. They are punished by having them work in the workhouses for little to no wage. So that makes it difficult for them to save money for things like property so that they can leave. And yes, they are encouraged to take the local work, so yay, and they've been cured of their affliction of laziness and whatever. But they're forced to come back in, and I'm not sure if that's because of their own choices. So yeah. The system is not designed to cure people of their moral infliction, only to provide them with the symptoms of this infliction. Also, there's this problem that the rich use these workhouses as poor farms for cheap labor, so that makes them less incentivized to actually hire workers. So that means there's less job for the people who are in these workhouses to take them so that they can leave. The system's a mess. There's a few other things that I would like to discuss here, but the research, the scripting, the filming, and the editing, likely, for this has already taken a while, so I'm going to leave it here. If I had more time, then some of the topics I would really want to include would be to compare this punishment framework to prison. I would also explore when we should be using this reward and punishment framework, or if, and how they should be used. I would also really like to speak about how this reward and punishment, how it relates to this Christian understanding of heaven and hell. And overall, I'd try to give better ideas on how this policy should have been implemented, given the knowledge that they had at the time. And just to end this, I want to include a little bit about myself and the perspective that I'm coming from. I'm a Catholic, and this has always been a large part of probably the largest part of my life. And being from a religious household typically does come with some conservative ideals. And yes, my parents were conservative for most of their life. Being from the Philippines might have helped or not helped that. But growing up, even though I went through the Catholic school system, most of my friends were not Catholic or Christian. And growing up in the late 2000s to early 2010 internet means that I was growing up at the height of this internet skeptics community. And everything was always a question of rationality, especially moral rationality, and also how religion is wrong. Around the same time, a friend brought me into the series of moral philosophy through these lectures from Harvard by Michael Sandel. And that's just been a real rabbit hole. But this is why I want to talk about the topic just a little bit. And as for why I wanted to really look into the specifics of the poor law, that's for a few reasons. One, I said in my intro video, I want this series to be educational. And two, it really provides us with some context that we need to understand the motivation. I'm still viewing it from a modern perspective, yes, but researching into its history, it really has helped me consider not just their motivations, but what options they had. In summation, the Poor Law passed in England in 1601, and it made providing poor relief a local responsibility. At around that time, people were now in records as being poor, and there were different classifications of the poor. It was later revised in 1834 in response to criticisms of the Poor Law promoting laziness, lack of effort, and generally low moral character. It became a punishment instead of relief. I argue that because the people with money have greater autonomy on the topic of poor relief, specifically within the context of the revised poor law, that these people have a greater responsibility in the moral duty of poor relief. I also say that the shift to punishment instead of relief is scummy and ineffective, since it becomes about coercing people about their moral standards, and doesn't actually help people become better. That's it. See you with the next one. You don't need to like or subscribe or anything because this is for class, but you can leave a comment and I'll get to it and it'll be fun.